Throughout history, many cultures and peoples have adhered to certain notions of moral values and ways of life, especially when it came to women. In most societies, particularly in ancient times and traditional cultures, women were perceived as bearers of moral purity and modesty, primarily before marriage. These societies had a clear understanding that a woman should maintain her innocence and chastity until the formalization of her union with a man. That is why society strictly monitored women's behavior, regulated their social circles, and controlled contacts with members of the opposite sex to protect them from temptations or casual acquaintances that could damage their reputation. These restrictions were often so strict that even relatives and acquaintances adhered to certain rules to avoid violating established norms. After marriage, a woman's role changed dramatically. She became entirely the property of her husband, dedicating her life, care, loyalty, and devotion to him. In this union, a woman was seen as part of the family unit, with her duty being to serve her spouse and maintain the household. However, all of this did not apply to men. Unlike women, men in those times, even during periods when marriage was under strict control of religious institutions, churches, or shamans, could indulge in certain liberties and deviations from strict moral rules. Their deviations were often overlooked, considered expressions of male nature or natural traits. As a result, men could lead a more salaya lifestyle, sometimes even allowing themselves minor sins or entertainments, while women were required to adhere to strict behavioral norms and moral purity. However, history also records unusual and sometimes shocking practices that completely overturned conventional ideas about family relations and the roles of spouses. One such practice, which causes surprise and bewilderment in the modern person, is polyandry, the practice of having multiple husbands, also called polyandry. Sometimes references to such rituals appear in dubious sources, where the theme of exotic and often mystical sexual customs is exploited. But in Tibet, within the traditional culture of this region, there was indeed a harsh and often cruel reality associated with the practice of polyandry. For local residents, it was not just a rare phenomenon, but a quite normal and accepted form of family organization. In this society, it was customary for a woman to have simultaneously from 3 to 5 husbands, and sometimes their number reached up to 10. It is important to emphasize that all these men were related to the woman by blood. Most often, they were her relatives or cousins, which made their relationships even more complex and multifaceted. Part 2 of 8. Now the question arises, how did such a numerous army of husbands share their time and attention with their only wife? Were there any established rules or principles that regulated intimate relationships in these unusual multi-husband families? And what took place inside the modest Tibetan hut, where one man after another entered to take his turn? Why, in the opinion of Tibetan women, did the more keys that had been in their lock, roughly speaking, the more men who had access to them, the more desirable and attractive they were considered? The more men a woman received attention from, the more she became a coveted bride, an object of desire and admiration. It is also interesting how questions of paternity were resolved within such families. How was fatherhood determined among the numerous children born in multi-husband households? What mechanisms and traditions were used to establish kinship and inheritance rights? These questions undoubtedly deserve special attention and will be discussed in this narrative. To fully understand and appreciate the delicacy of this topic, it is recommended to listen to the story with headphones, so that those around do not become accidental listeners and do not interfere with focusing on the subtle nuances of the customs described. In Tibet, within the framework of ancient traditions, polygamy was not a random phenomenon, but the result of complex historical, social, and economic conditions that had been rooted in Tibetan family life for centuries. This tradition was based on deeply ingrained customs and practices, primarily driven by poverty and modest living conditions. Tibetan families often owned only small plots of land and livestock, which collectively provided very limited resources to support all members. Under such circumstances, each additional person, especially if it was a woman, became an important element in maintaining and even increasing the family's household. When the eldest son, reaching adulthood, married, he brought his chosen bride into the home. According to ancient traditions, her property, as well as everything she contributed to the household, became part of the common property, becoming an integral part of their shared life. As a result, the family acquired something like a joint fund, which included not only land and livestock, but also the bride's personal belongings. This order was not only traditional but also practical. It ensured stability and prevented the dispersion of resources. If, for some reason, the eldest son decided to break the established system and, contrary to tradition, separate from his parents, home, build his own dwelling, and start an independent life, it would mean serious economic losses for his parents. In such a case, they would lose part of the family property that could be used to support other children, or in case of necessity. Part 3 of 8. The issue was particularly acute in families where there were, say, 10 sons. Each of them, upon deciding to leave and establish his own household, would take a significant portion of the parents' resources. As a result, for elderly parents who needed care and financial support in their old age, such a situation could become tragic. They might be left with almost nothing, in a dire state, unable to rely on their adult children for help. To avoid this dangerous scenario, Tibetan traditions and customs were supplemented with a special trick that served as a kind of mechanism to protect family property. After the eldest son's marriage, the bride, who had already become the legal wife, would move into her husband's house, that is, to his parents and brothers who were not yet married. In this case, the new wife became part of a large family collective, united by common interests and responsibilities. Tibetan dwellings were generally quite compact and modest in size, due to the conditions of mountain life, harsh climate, and limited resources. Consequently, there was no opportunity to accommodate numerous brides and their families in one house. Therefore, it was decided that one wife would be connected to all the brothers simultaneously, allowing for the most efficient use of living space. This approach not only preserved family resources but also significantly reduced material costs. There was no need to build and maintain separate houses for each family, which would be too expensive and impractical. Besides economic benefits, this method also addressed the issue of space. For the privacy of young spouses, a small, modest hut was usually built near the main dwelling, or at least a small room was designated, separated from outsiders. This measure provided the necessary privacy and also served as a kind of protection against possible malicious actions by the new wives, because in a polygamous setting, where a wife shared a house and life with several brothers, it was difficult to abuse her position without the risk of being noticed. Interestingly, this system, despite its apparent complexity, led to a certain social protection and even served as a barrier against cunning and treachery from the new wives. If a bride, possessing sharp wit and malicious intent, wished to deceive and acquire more inheritance from a trusting and innocent elder brother, it would be much more difficult to do so. The other brothers kept a vigilant eye on her actions, monitored her behavior, and prevented abuses of her position. This created a certain safeguard. The question of the inner life and feelings of Tibetan women, deprived of the freedom of choice and found in a highly dependent position, evokes considerable surprise and reflection. Part 4 of 8. How they perceived their fate when they found themselves in a position close to ownership, since they often became not just wives, but part of someone else's, unfamiliar destinies belonging to several men simultaneously. A quite natural question arises. Did such a humiliating and powerless situation, where they turned into property of multiple men, trouble them? Was their heart not filled with internal protest, or at least a vague longing for freedom? The answer to this question is probably not so straightforward, because, in most cases, despite the apparent severity and lack of personal rights, most women seemingly found ways to ease their situation and even, to some extent, find satisfaction. Interestingly, such women generally experienced their strongest and most sincere feelings toward the man who first took them as his wife, most often an older brother or close relative, who played the role of a kind of pioneer of the new wife. Over time, as they lived together in the same house, they often developed a special, deeper, affectionate interest in one of the brothers, usually the one who stood out among the others by his character or behavior. As a result, women often formed favorites among their brothers, paying them special attention, highlighting them among the others, and making them more noticeable in their eyes. This internal mechanism was undoubtedly inherent to a certain part of women, who, almost intuitively, found in these relationships a particular comfort and joy. Men, in turn, tried in every way to please their lawful wives, showing maximum attention and care. They spared no effort to fulfill any of her whims and caprices, helped with household chores, and looked after her well-being and good mood. The mutual relationships between husbands and wives often developed on the basis of mutual respect and even a certain playful servility. One interesting fact illustrating the peculiarities of Tibetan families is that the more a man earned or brought into the home in material value, the more attractive he became in his wife's eyes. For example, if the youngest brother suddenly became rich, found a large treasure, successfully sold livestock, or acquired wealth, her gaze immediately and inevitably began to fall more often on him. In such cases, the wife would try to retreat as often as possible with this brother, going into a small, modest hut to be alone and share personal happiness with him. This phenomenon was quite natural, since material well-being was considered one of the main criteria of attractiveness and respect in a Tibetan family. Regarding marital duty and its fulfillment in Tibetan life, it had its own peculiarities. Each husband was assigned a strictly defined day when he could spend time alone with his wife. On that day, the wives would retreat to a separate room to indulge in carnal pleasures and enjoy time together, while the other husbands remained in different houses with their parents, waiting for their turn. This strictly regulated rhythm helped maintain balance and order within the numerous polygamous families. There were cases when a wife preferred to spend time only with certain favorites, completely ignoring the other brothers. In such situations, the other brothers, feeling neglected, had every right to complain to the parents who, as the supreme overseers of family relations, tried to resolve the conflict and guide the wife back onto the right path. In these cases, women tried not to show their discontent outwardly, so as not to provoke the parents' anger or incur their just, though strict, criticism. They aimed to give equal attention to all brothers to avoid provoking conflict or accusations of betrayal or disobedience. In ancient times, when life in remote Tibetan villages was particularly unique, people often resorted to quite unusual and specific methods of procreation to ensure the continuation of the family line, while also reducing the risks associated with hereditary diseases. At that time, an entirely unrelated man would come to help, often a foreigner who happened to be in these parts, or a neighboring resident from a nearby village, who was specially invited to perform a very important and specific role. His task was to help conceive a long-awaited heir, and despite its unusual nature, this ritual was widespread in those regions. Interestingly, children born as a result of this practice, although having different biological parents, were still considered full members of the families of all the brothers, regardless of who their biological father was. This approach was rooted in deep traditions and local cultural peculiarities, as well as pragmatic considerations. It served to dilute the genetic material, reduce the likelihood of hereditary diseases, which in the high-altitude environment with its harsh climate and inaccessible nature could significantly weaken the inhabitants' health. These illnesses, causing weakness and lowered immunity, made people more vulnerable and decreased their chances of survival in such harsh conditions. Turning to the customs and behavior of girls in the Tibetan village, it is impossible not to note that their traditions and morals differed significantly from those accepted in Europe or the Russian Empire of that time. While in European countries and Russia girls generally adhered to certain rules of modesty and restraint, young women in Tibet behaved quite differently. They were unashamed to tell their friends and acquaintances about their romantic adventures, sharing the most intimate and even spicy details of their love stories without any embarrassment. For them, there was nothing shameful about talking about their past, and moreover, they believed that virginity before marriage was not a significant or valuable trait. In some cases, it was even considered strange or sometimes abnormal to preserve virginity until marriage, as their culture valued open and free attitudes towards love and personal life. Such views on intimacy led to the perception that girls who were avoided or considered unapproachable because they did not follow traditional modesty were seen as incomplete or even not entirely worthy of attention. The appearance of a Tibetan girl walking through the village often allowed one to determine how many admirers she had, even without speaking to her. It seemed incredible, but they had a special way of reading. Girls wore a special necklace around their neck, made of various beads and coins, which served as a kind of counter for romantic victories. When a young man came for tea and conversation with a girl he liked, he performed a special ritual, symbolically dipping his tea bag into her cup, thus expressing his admiration. As a sign of recognition and affection, the man usually gave her a small silver coin or a beautiful bead, a gift that became part of her necklace. Over time, these decorations accumulated, turning into a fairly long and colorful necklace, through which everyone could see how many admirers had shared tea with this lady and how many suitors she had. This method served as a kind of mark. Everyone who saw the necklace could understand how many times and with whom the girl had shared tea and conversation. Of course, modern notions of decency and ethics make such behavior unacceptable and even indecent, as in contemporary society, such counters are considered too provocative and frivolous. However, in Old Tibet, these adornments were perceived quite differently. Their owners enjoyed special respect, and a necklace with numerous beads and coins was a kind of proof of popularity and attractiveness. If, in the distant past, there was a phenomenon across Tibet that today would probably be hard to imagine in modern society, but at that time was completely normal and widespread. This was the practice of polygamy, which was an important part of traditional Tibetan culture. However, besides that, there was another very specific feature of Tibetan life that today might evoke surprise or even rejection in a modern person. This is what will be discussed further. As we discussed earlier, after a woman got married, she lived in the house of her new relatives, usually with her husband's brothers and their parents, who together managed the household. Within this family system, there was a very important and seemingly quite unusual rule. It was not considered shameful, and sometimes even accepted, for the father-in-law, who in Tibetan culture often served as the head of the family, to visit his young bride without prior invitation. This visit was not viewed as something disgraceful or immoral. On the contrary, all family members understood and even approved of it. At that time, such behavior was regarded as a natural expression of family traditions and norms. For a modern person living under an enlightened and often more strict societal opinion, such a phenomenon might seem wild or even unacceptable. However, in Tibetan culture, these visits by the father-in-law to the daughter-in-law were seen as an integral part of family life. Eyewitnesses recount that when all the brothers, and sometimes even the lustful father-in-law himself, visited the modest Tibetan home in turn, the situation could become quite humorous and even a little chaotic. During such moments, especially considering that mountain regions often suffered from sharp temperature fluctuations, which contributed to the formation of slush and dirt on the streets, the floor of the house could literally be squelching from the multitude of guests who came on family matters or simply to visit. The wife, over time, usually became so hospitable and accustomed to this peculiar herd of lustful visitors that she perceived it as a natural part of her life. Gradually, she grew used to the constant visits from relatives and to the unusual order in the house, which today in most cultures would be seen as a violation of personal boundaries and unacceptable behavior. At that time it was considered normal, emphasizing the special closeness and trust within the Tibetan kinship. Interestingly, do you now wonder whether such a custom still exists somewhere on the planet today? Perhaps in remote corners, or among traditional communities, it still survives, hidden from outsiders. The question remains open, and perhaps such traditions have persisted in certain communities or cases, despite the global changes in social structure and moral norms. I hope this brief excursion into the era and culture of ancient Tibet has made you think about the differences in worldview and family values, as well as how perceptions of norms and customs change over time. Consider how much our world has changed, and which past traditions you might find astonishing or even shocking for a modern person. And finally, the only question that remains is, do similar customs still exist somewhere in the world today? Perhaps in remote corners of the planet, there are traditions that seem outdated or strange to us, but for the local inhabitants, they are part of their heritage and identity. I hope this topic has sparked your interest and desire to share your thoughts. I will conclude my speech here. I hope it has been informative and engaging for you. In the future, we will certainly continue to explore the fascinating and diverse traditions of peoples around the world.